Let me tell you about the morning they laughed at the widow, because I was there, and I have thought about that morning for a long time since. It was the first week of May, 1989, in the flat green bottomland of Tensas Parish, Louisiana, 12 miles south of a town called Newellton, on a gravel road that ran so straight and so empty, it seemed to forget it was supposed to lead anywhere. The heat had come early that year. By 8 in the morning, the air was thick enough to lean on, and the cicadas had started up in the cypress along the slough. It was a Thursday, the day the feed truck ran the river road, and that was how half the parish came to see what Eleanor Boudreaux had done. She was 51 years old that spring. Her husband Raymond had been dead a little over 2 years by then, a heart that quit on him in the cab of his own tractor at the edge of the back 40, which is the kind of thing that happens to men who never learn how to stop working. They had no children living. A son had died small, decades back, the way children sometimes did in that country before the roads got good enough to reach a hospital in time. So when Raymond went, Eleanor was left with 300 acres of cotton and bean ground, a sagging house her grandfather had built, and 40 acres in the southeast corner that nobody in 3 generations had ever made grow anything but water and frogs. That morning, she had a flatbed trailer backed up to the county road, an old green Chevrolet with a tailgate held shut by a loop of baling wire, and she was unloading crates, 30 of them. Each crate held 1 duck. And these were not the small white ducks a person keeps for eggs by the back porch. These were Muscovies, great heavy birds, 10 to 14 pounds apiece, broad across the back, with that strange red warty skin around the eyes that makes a stranger step back without knowing why. Muscovies do not quack. They hiss, and they grunt, and they look at you the way an old judge looks at a man he has already decided about. 30 of them, shifting and complaining, and Eleanor lifting each crate down by herself in a faded cotton dress and a man's work boots. Now, here is what you need to understand about that parish. People there were not cruel, but they were certain. They had farmed that ground their whole lives, and their fathers before them, and they knew what grew in Tensas bottomland, and what did not. And so when Tom Hargrove pulled up in his clean white pickup, the one he washed every Sunday whether it needed it or not, and rolled down his window and looked at 30 fat ducks and 40 acres of standing swamp behind the fence, he smiled the particular smile a man uses when he has already decided you are wrong, but is willing to stay and watch you prove it. "Eleanor," he said, "what in the Lord's name are you fixing to do with 30 ducks on 40 acres of frog water?" She told him she was going to grow rice. He laughed, not meanly. Tom was not a mean man. He laughed the way you laugh at something that simply cannot go the way the person imagines it. He said something about how Raymond would have talked her out of it, and he meant it kindly, and that was somehow worse. Then he drove on. 2 more trucks slowed that morning. A third just lifted 2 fingers off the wheel as he passed, which in that country is the most efficient way a man has of telling you he thinks you've lost your mind. By dinner, the way Eleanor told it later, the cafe in Newellton already had a version of the story, and in that version she had bought 60 ducks, or 100, and had finally gone soft in the head with grief. Poor thing. All alone out there on the river road. And this is the part that matters. They were not laughing at the ducks. They were laughing at a woman alone who had dared to think she saw something 3 generations of men had missed. That Southeast 40 had a name in the family. Raymond's grandfather had called it the drowned ground. Raymond's father called it the same. For as long as anyone could remember, that parcel grew nothing but cattail and sedge and mosquitoes, and a particular kind of quiet despair that comes from watching good dirt refuse to behave. Raymond had run drainage ditches through it in 1968. He'd tried again, with tile, in 1979. Both times the water won. Both times he came back to the house in the evening and didn't speak much at supper, and Eleanor learned not to ask. But Eleanor had something Raymond, for all his stubbornness, had never sat still long enough to read. She had a notebook. She'd found it the winter after he died, going through a cedar chest in the back bedroom because she could not yet bear to sit still. And sorting old things was a way to keep her hands busy while her mind went where it needed to go. It was an ordinary thing. A nickel composition book with a black and white marbled cover gone soft at the corners, the kind they sold at the dry goods store before the war. Inside the front cover, in pencil, a name, not Raymond's, Alcide Boudreaux, Raymond's grandfather, and below it, a date, 1934. Most of it was farm accounts, seed cost, mule feed, the price of a day chopping cotton, bale weights logged in a small even hand, the careful penmanship of a generation that treated handwriting as a kind of moral discipline. Eleanor read it slowly through that first long winter, partly to understand the man Raymond came from, partly just to hear another voice in a house gone very silent. And near the back, separated from the accounts by 3 blank pages, as though old Alcide had wanted some distance between the things he knew for certain and the things he only suspected. There were 6 pages in a faster, looser hand. The hand of a man thinking rather than recording. He had written about a Cajun farmer down in the rice country near Crowley, a man named Thibodeau, who flooded his low ground on purpose and ran ducks across it, and swore the birds did something to the hard dirt underneath that no plow could do. Alcide had written it down the way you write down a thing you can't prove but can't quite let go of. And then he had died, and Raymond's father had never read past the cotton accounts, and Raymond had never read it at all. And the notebook had pressed down in the bottom of that cedar chest under quilts and Christmas things for 55 years, waiting for someone with enough grief and enough time to read it slowly. Eleanor was that someone. And on that hot Thursday morning in May, with the whole parish driving by to watch her make a fool of herself, she was unloading the first 30 pages of an answer her husband's family had been carrying, unread, for 3 generations. But that's not what this story is really about. Not yet. A note for you, before we go on. Muscovy ducks are not truly ducks at all in the way most people mean the word. They are a separate species, native to Central and South America, domesticated long before Europeans arrived. They are heavier than common ducks. They perch and roost like geese, and instead of quacking, they hiss. Farmers value them for foraging. They eat slugs, larvae, and weeds aggressively, and they tread soft ground constantly as they feed. For most of the 20th century, American farmers thought of them only as meat birds. Almost no one thought of them as a tool for the soil itself. Part 2. Now here is what you need to understand about the drowned ground, because everything that came after began with Eleanor learning to read it. She did not flood that field the day she bought the ducks. That is the mistake an impatient person makes, and grief had taught Eleanor a great deal about patience by then. The ducks went into a pen up near the barn. 30 awkward, complaining, half-grown things that had arrived in a cardboard box, peeping like a box of broken whistles, and that she fed and watered and watched, while she spent the cold end of that winter doing something nobody in the parish would have guessed. She walked the drowned 40, over and over. In February, when the ground froze just hard enough some mornings to hold her weight, she walked it with a fence stake in one hand and a hammer in the other, and she studied where the water went. And here is what she found, which surprised her. The water did not sit on that field evenly, the way everyone assumed. It followed a long, shallow crease that ran diagonally across the parcel, from the high northwest corner down toward the old drainage ditch in the south. Not a channel, exactly. More like a soft wrinkle in the earth, maybe 8 inches lower than the ground on either side of it. You would never see it walking in summer. The cattails grew across it without complaint. But in a wet year, that crease filled first and drained last, and it was the reason certain stretches of that field had drowned while others merely sulked. Eleanor had lived beside that ground for 30 years, and never once understood it. Raymond had fought it for 40, and never read it either. She drove a fence stake into the crease every 40 feet, swinging the hammer with both hands while her breath came out in clouds. 17 stakes, in a line that curved gently, almost like a question. And when she stood back at the fence and looked at them, she could see the whole field differently. The crease was not a curse she had inherited. It was the one feature of that ground that read correctly, told you exactly where to put the water and exactly where to take it out. Old Alcide's notebook described the rest, and it was not complicated. A low earthen berm, built by hand, to hold water on the field at a chosen depth. And at the outlet, a simple wooden riser, a stack of boards in a frame, the kind duck hunters had built across the south for 100 years. Add a board, the water rises an inch. Pull a board, it falls. You move water on or off in hours instead of days, with no engine, no pump, nothing a man needs an engineer to stamp. The whole thing costs lumber and labor and nothing else. Eleanor was careful though, and this is a thing I admire about her. She did not just go dig. In late February, she drove into town and sat down with the man at the parish agricultural extension office. who had been there 19 years and understood low ground the way she understood her own kitchen. She described her plan plainly. He was quiet a moment, then said he'd seen something like it in the rice country to the west, and saw no reason it couldn't work in Texas, but warned her to be careful never to back water up into the parish drainage ditch in a wet season, or she'd have a conversation with the road superintendent she would not enjoy. So she went and had that conversation first, on her own terms. She drove to the parish road barn on a Thursday morning and spoke straight to the superintendent, a heavyset man who'd grown up 2 sections over and knew exactly what it meant to manage low ground. She laid it out plain. He asked her 2 questions: where the berm would sit relative to the ditch, and whether she could drain her field before the spring rains came up. She answered both honestly. He thought a while, looking at her, maybe weighing whether a widow alone could really do what she said. Then he told her that as long as she kept the ditch clear and her outlet working, he saw no quarrel with the parish. She drove home with that in her pocket. It wasn't a permit, but it was real, and she knew the difference. That same afternoon, she walked the field again with a tape measure and Alcide's notebook, and she paced off what she meant to flood: 240 feet along the north edge, 190 along the east, tapering down toward the outlet she planned to cut near the southern corner. The ground fell about 15 inches across the length of it, just enough drop to drain the whole thing by gravity. No pump, if she set the outlet pipe right. She wrote her numbers in pencil because the cold made the pen skip, the same way her husband's grandfather had written his. The berm was the part she thought about longest. She would not hire it out. She had Raymond's old tractor, a 1971 Ford with a back blade that had moved more dirt on that farm than any contractor's machine. And she had time, which is the one thing widowhood had given her in cruel abundance. What she did not have was a way to do it fast, and Alcide's notebook told her not to try. Build a berm in one push, he'd written, and you are building a problem, not a wall. So she built it the way he said, lift by lift. A course of dirt, packed firm with the tractor's rear wheels, left to dry. Then another course on top. Alcide had built a stock pond that way in 1938, and it was still holding water when Eleanor was a girl. She spent the first 3 weeks of March moving earth, 3 hours each morning before the frost came out of the ground and the dirt went soft. Then she'd stop and let it rest. By the 20th of March, she had a berm along the north and east edges, 20 inches at the crown, packed firm enough to walk without sinking. The outlet went in on a warm Saturday. A salvaged 12-inch culvert with a board riser she set to hold about 9 inches of water across the low center of the field. Not deep, just deep enough that a Muscovy could work the bottom everywhere it walked without ever having to swim. The ducks by then were grown, 40-some days old, white feathers filled in across the breast, moving with that settled, deliberate weight that I find a strangely peaceful thing to watch. Still loud, still opinionated about everything under the sun. But the chaos of the early weeks had hardened into something that looked, from the fence, almost like order. And that's when everything changed. Because in the second week of April, Eleanor opened the inlet, and the drowned ground began, at last, to do exactly what she told it to. A note for you. The wooden water control riser Eleanor used is one of the oldest and simplest tools in American land management. Wetland managers and rice farmers still use the same basic design today. A frame holding removable boards, sometimes called flashboards or stop logs. By adding or removing a board, a single person can raise or lower the water level across many acres by hand. It requires no electricity and almost no maintenance. Much of the practical wisdom of small farming lies not in expensive machinery but in cheap, old, well-understood ideas like this one. Part 3. She flooded on the 14th of April, a Tuesday. She opened the inlet from the ditch at 7 in the morning, and by 2 in the afternoon the low center of the drowned 40 held a sheet of shallow water, maybe 9 inches at the deepest, thinning to nothing at the edges. And then she opened the pen and let the ducks down to it. I wish you could have seen it, the way Eleanor told it. 30 Muscovies who had spent their whole short lives on dry ground in a pen, walking down the slope toward open water for the first time. They went slow, the way Muscovies go, suspicious of everything, and then one of the big drakes hit the water's edge and went still, and dropped his head, and began to work the soft bottom with his bill, that pressing, searching motion they have. And within an hour, all 30 of them were spread across the shallows doing the same thing, pressing, treading, tipping forward to run their bills through the mud after whatever lived in it. foot and bill, all day long. Now here's what you need to understand, and what Eleanor herself did not fully understand yet, though Alcide's notebook had pointed at it. A duck on shallow flooded ground is not just feeding, it is working the soil. 30 heavy birds, 10,000 small pressings a day each, across the same shallow ground, week after week. That is a kind of tillage no machine performs, because no machine is patient enough or light enough to do it. The ducks ate the cattail shoots before they could establish. They ate the slugs and the larvae. They churned the top few inches of muck into something soft and aerated and alive. And underneath, slowly, where 3 generations of plows and tile had failed, something began to give. Eleanor planted rice in late April, broadcasting the seed by hand into the shallow water from a bucket at her hip, walking the field in Raymond's old boots while the ducks moved around her like she was just another large, slow bird among them. She had ordered the seed from a supply house in the rice country to the west, a long-grain variety bred for shallow flooding, and the man on the telephone had asked her 3 times how many acres, as if he could not believe a woman in Tensa's parish was ordering rice seed at all. The rice came up. Of course it came up. Rice wants exactly what that field finally offered, warm, shallow water over soft ground. By the middle of June, the drowned 40, the parcel that had grown nothing but cattail and despair for 50 years, stood in straight green rows of young rice with 30 white ducks moving slow between them. And the same men who had laughed in May began, one by one, to slow their trucks on the county road and look over the fence without saying anything at all. Tom Hargrove was the first to stop. He stood at the fence a long time, hands in his pockets, looking at the green field and the ducks. Finally he said, "Eleanor, I'll be damned." And he meant it as an apology, in the only language he had for one. She let him stand there. She had learned, in 2 years alone, the value of letting a remark sit until the other person follows it to its own end. But the part that matters most came later, and it came from a stranger. That August, a young man from the state university drove out the river road in a state car, looking for the Boudreaux place. He was a soil scientist, soft-handed, careful, with a probe and a notebook and one of those early portable computers in a padded case. He'd heard, the way people in his line of work hear things, that a widow down in Tensas was growing rice on ground the parish soil survey had marked, back in 1963, as having a hardpan layer, a compacted clay floor about 14 inches down, so dense and so permanent that the survey had flatly written that nothing short of deep mechanical subsoiling would ever break it. That field, the survey said, would never drain and never farm. And here it stood, green with rice. He asked Eleanor's permission to take some probe readings, and she gave it, and she walked the field with him while he worked. She told me later she liked him because he was quiet and did not pretend to know things he didn't. He pushed his steel probe into the ground at 8 points across the field, and at each one he frowned a little more. Then he crouched and rubbed a pinch of the deep soil between his fingers, the way you do when you're trying to understand a thing by feel instead of by number. Raymond used to do exactly that, Eleanor said, and watching the young man do it put a small ache in her chest. When he came back to where she stood by the fence post, he looked at his readings a long moment before he spoke. He said the water table had dropped measurably. He said the hardpan, the compaction layer the parish had called permanent in 1963, showed signs of disruption at 4 of his 8 probe points. He said he was not sure what had caused it. Then he looked out at the ducks working the soft eastern margin in their slow, rhythmic way, foot and bill, and he was quiet for a while. And then he said it, almost to himself. "Those ducks are breaking up your hardpan." Eleanor did not correct him. She did not explain. She let the observation sit between them, the way you let a thing sit when you want a man to walk to the truth on his own legs. He stood there another minute watching them. Then he looked back at his probe readings, then at the ducks again, and she could see him trying to reconcile what his instrument was telling him with what his own eyes were watching 30 feet away. And that's when everything changed for the last time. Because that young man asked Eleanor a question, and her answer to it was sitting in a cedar chest in the back bedroom, written in pencil, in 1934. A note for you. Soil compaction is one of the most stubborn problems in agriculture. A dense, compacted layer beneath the surface, often called a hardpan or plowpan, blocks roots and traps water, and breaking it usually requires heavy machinery dragging deep tines through the ground at great cost. Researchers have long known that biological activity, roots, worms, and the trampling of animals on wet ground can loosen soil over time. But it is slow, and it rarely gets credited because it does not look like work. It looks like animals simply going about their day. Part 4. He asked her how long she had been running ducks on that ground. She told him the truth, that this was the first year on the rice itself, but that the idea was older than she was, that her husband's grandfather had written it down before the war. He asked, careful now, whether he might see what the man had written, and Eleanor said she'd bring it up to the house. They sat at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour. The nickel composition book opened between them. He turned the pages the way a man handles a thing he has realized is evidence. Old Alcide's handwriting was small and angular, the script of a generation that learned penmanship as a discipline of character. The young scientist read without speaking. Now and then he made a note in his own pad. He read the cotton accounts and the bale weights, and then he came to the 6 loose pages near the back, the ones in the faster hand, and Eleanor watched him slow down and go still. He read the part about the Cajun farmer near Crowley, the man Thibodeau who flooded his low ground and ran ducks across it and swore the birds did something to the hard dirt that no plow could do. He read it twice. Then he set the notebook down very gently, and he looked at Eleanor for a long moment and he said, "Ma'am, this was written in 1934. She said it was. He told her what that meant. The parish soil survey had first mapped that hard pan in 1963. The published work he knew of on relieving compaction through waterfowl on flooded ground was newer than that, something a few researchers had begun to look at seriously only in recent years. And here, in a 5-cent composition book in a cedar chest in Tensas Parish, a cotton farmer with a 6th grade education had written the whole idea down in plain pencil 29 years before the survey even found the problem he was describing the cure for. He asked if he could take readings across the whole field, and over the next weeks he came back 3 more times, and what he found he laid out for Eleanor at her own kitchen table in the fall. The hard pan had not broken up evenly. It had fractured in a pattern, and the pattern followed the paths the ducks walked most. Along the corridors where the flock returned day after day to feed, the compacted layer was disrupted deepest, 9 to 13 inches down. Along the stretches the birds used less. The layer was still there, just thinner. The rice had answered accordingly. Where the ducks walked most, the roots had gone down full, and the heads stood heavy. Where they walked less, the rice was adequate, but not exceptional. He said he had never seen field documentation of compaction relieved this way through the simple repeated pressure of birds on wet ground. He said the 1934 notebook was, as far as he knew, the earliest written observation of the idea he had ever encountered, predating the formal study of it by half a century. He asked her permission to write about it, and to quote old Alcide's words directly, and to name the parish and the year. Eleanor said she would think about it. The rice came off in the last week of September and the first days of October. A neighbor 2 miles east loaned her a small combine, an old machine not really built for the conditions but good enough. The yield ran 41 bushels to the acre on the eastern half, 37 on the western where the hard pan had been more stubborn. Now I will be honest with you. Those are not numbers that would impress a real rice operation over in Arkansas or down in the Louisiana paddies. But on 40 acres that 4 months earlier held standing water and grew nothing but cattail and mosquitoes, on the drowned ground that 3 generations of Boudreaux men had given up for lost, those numbers were not really a yield at all. They were an answer. The duck she moved into the barn that November, 31 by then, because one of the hens had hatched a clutch in August and she'd kept a few of the young. Muscovies are not dramatic animals. They accept what is offered and they make use of it. And they walked into the converted stalls without much complaint and settled in for the winter. In December, she wrote to the young man at the university and told him he had her permission to use the notebook and to quote her husband's grandfather directly and to name the year and the parish. She asked only one thing, that he get old Alcide's name right. The paper came out the following spring, in a journal she had never heard of and never read again, and a friend's son in town printed her a copy off a library machine. There it was, Alcide Boudreaux's own sentence, the one about the ducks and the hard dirt, quoted in a footnote, with the year 1934 beside it. Eleanor told me that seeing it in print did something to her she had not expected. Not pride exactly, more like a thing being finished that had been left open a long, long time. And the neighbors. The ones who had slowed their trucks that first May and laughed kindly and driven on. A few came back that next fall and stood at her fence and looked at the rice stubble and the ducks moving through it and didn't say much. One of them, an older man who had farmed beside Raymond for 30 years, finally asked her how she had known, and Eleanor told him the truth. She said, "I didn't know anything. A man who's been dead 50 years wrote it down, and I was the first one in this family with enough quiet in my life to read it slow enough to understand. That is the whole of it, really. If you'll let an old story leave you with one thing, let it be this. If you've got a piece of ground that won't grow, or a way of doing things that everyone tells you is finished, or an old notebook in a drawer written by somebody who had the time to pay attention, don't be in a hurry to throw any of it away." The answers are very often sitting in the old places, waiting on someone patient enough to find them. The slow things outlast the clever ones. Raymond Boudreaux knew that. His grandson never got the chance to. And it took a widow alone, with nothing left but time and grief and 30 hissing ducks, to finally read it slow enough to prove him right. Eleanor kept the notebook on the kitchen windowsill after that, where the morning light came in over the drowned ground that was not drowned anymore. And on the days the weight of being alone pressed hardest on her, she told me, she would take it down, open it to those 6 loose pages near the back, read her husband's grandfather's handwriting, look out at the rice, and feel, for a moment, in the quiet, like she was not, after all, the only one out there on the river road who had ever believed in that ground. A note for you, to close. The story of a discovery is almost never the story of a single clever moment. It is usually the story of an idea that was noticed, set down, lost, and then found again by someone willing to take it seriously. Knowledge in farming, and in most things, is passed forward unevenly, written in margins, kept in drawers, carried by people who never thought of themselves as experts. Often the most valuable thing a person can do is not to invent something new, but to pay close, patient attention to what someone before them already took the trouble to write down.